Dzień dobry. My name is Igor Krupnik. I'm curator at the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. And I have been asked by my colleagues to start this very special presentation that is focused on the connections between Polish anthropologists and the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. I also was told that everything tonight has to be in English. So this is going to be all English presentations about three significantly known anthropologists, two Polish, one American, and that would be an exchange in knowledge between the two countries. What is the Smithsonian Institution and why it has been chosen as a topic for today's event? Today, the Smithsonian Institution is a huge complex of museums, education, and research centers in downtown Washington, D.C. It was established in 1846 by the act of the U.S. Congress with the mandate of increase and diffusion of knowledge. Smithsonian is named after its late donor, British scientist James Smithson, who bequeathed his funds to build an institution of knowledge in the United States. It's a long story why Smithson left all his money to the New Republic, but we won't go there today. The Smithsonian is kind of a sprawl of buildings and centers and museums. It includes a zoo, historical and architectural landmarks all across Washington, D.C., in New York, Florida, and Panama. It also housed one of the earliest museums in the United States, the museum which is now called the National Museum of Natural History, where I work, that used to be the U.S. National Museum. And this is where our story starts today. In addition to the U.S. National Museum, in 1879, U.S. Congress established a very strange research unit, which was called Bureau of Ethnology and later Bureau of American Ethnology. It was led by a very charismatic figure, Major John Wesley Powell, United States Civil War veteran, geologist, and explorer. And Powell argued for the creation of the Bureau of Ethnology, as he put it, to advance the study of the American Indians. Today we call it Native American cultures and languages. And under Powell and its successors, the BAE, as we call it, became the leading hub for the linguistic, ethnographic, and archaeological research on Native Americans in the US and worldwide. The legacy of the BAE that was closed in 1965 lives in its many publications, voluminous archival collections that are now part of the National Museum of Natural History. When the BAE was closed in 1965, the Smithsonian Department of Anthropology launched another initiative that lives till today, which is called the Handbook of North American Indians. You can see these majestic, large gray volumes on a shelf. This is the encyclopedia of knowledge about Native American communities and cultures and languages. And this will be something that we will be referring today in some of our presentations. This brings me finally to the concluding slide, the list of three speakers that are going to talk today. In that very order, Marcin Kilarski, professor of linguistics at the Adam Mickiewicz University. He will be speaking about G.N.B. Hewitt, who was a linguist and ethnologist at the Bureau of American Ethnology that I just mentioned. Tomasz Wicherkiewicz, another professor of linguistics at the same university. We'll be talking about famous Polish anthropologist Bronisław Piłsudski and his work on the Sakhalin and the Russian Far East. And I will be the last speaker talking about yet another Polish anthropologist, Stanisław Poniatowski, and his trip to the Amur River on behalf of the Smithsonian Institution and his collections that we have here in Washington, D.C. Thank you, and I'll pass the baton to Marcin.
Thank you. So in our first presentation, we're going to go back to the late 19th century to trace the career of John Napoleon Brinton Hewitt as a linguist and ethnologist. More specifically, we'll look at the first 2 decades of his career in order to see how it began and what people and events shaped it. Hewitt was born in the Tuscarora Reservation, Niagara County in New York State. Without having a college degree, between 1880 and 1886, he worked as a consultant with Amur Smith in her documentation of northern Iroquoian languages, particularly Tuscarora, Seneca, and Onondaga. After her death in 1886, he was employed by John Wesley Powell, the founding director of the Bureau of Ethnology, from 1894 called the Bureau of American Ethnology. He worked at the Bureau as an ethnologist until his death in 1937. The mapping and classification of North American languages were a major project at the Bureau under Powell's leadership. Here you can see a part of the first map that was published. It shows language families, including Iroquoian, with the original location of Tuscarora speakers in eastern North Carolina. After the Tuscarora Wars, at the beginning of the 18th century, the remaining Tuscaroras migrated to New York State. Amur Smith was a geologist, ethnologist, and linguist. Despite a very short career, she published extensively and was a member or officer of several scholarly societies, including the American Association for the Advancement of Science. This picture shows her at the last meeting of the association that she attended, during which she was elected secretary of the section for anthropology, being the first woman in this position. Hewitt's and Smith's major project was to compile a dictionary of Tuscarora. The material was arranged in slips, 2 of which can be seen here, with words for go and goat. A manuscript was submitted in 1885 for publication, and after Smith's death, Hewitt was employed by Powell to finish the project. It was, however, only in 1999 that the dictionary was published by Blair Roots, based on re-elicited data from the manuscript, as well as Hewitt's remaining unpublished Tuscarora data. In addition to Smith and Powell, Hewitt's career was shaped by Daniel Garrison Brinton, the first professor of archaeology and linguistics at the University of Pennsylvania and president in 1894 of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Although Brinton was widely known as an anthropologist, the audiences and societies of Philadelphia were his main connection with the scholarly world. Hence, he can be described as, quote, a bookish scholar playing a lone hand in Philadelphia. So what happened was that Hewitt and Brinton exchanged a series of papers between 1885 and 1896, which dealt with 3 pervasive aspects of complex word structure in North American languages: polysynthesis, holophrases, and noun incorporation. The 2 scholars offer contrasting approaches to these phenomena, with Brinton's sweeping evolutionary generalizations countered by Hewitt's detailed morphological analysis. As Hewitt says, facts and reasons must take the place of authorities. In addition to these theoretical and methodological differences, the papers offer an entertaining exercise in polemics. They abound in disparaging remarks about the opponent's linguistic knowledge, integrity as a scholar, and personal qualities. For example, Hewitt dismisses Brinton's description of polysynthesis as clearly defective and incomplete, and romance and not comparative grammar. Hewitt's critique of an established scholar wasn't well received. It seems that in consequence of the debate, Hewitt abandoned theoretical work and focused on the collection and description of texts. In time, he became an authority in Iroquoian studies. His publications include the 2-volume Iroquoian Cosmology, together with numerous ethnographic papers, as well as entries in the Handbook of American Indians north of Mexico. In this photograph, he is pictured with Mary Baldwin, always neatly dressed. In conclusion, Hewitt was clearly a remarkable scholar. Already in 1903, he was described by W.J. McKee, Hewitt's mentor at the Bureau, as second only to Franz Boas among American scholars in his linguistic knowledge. His later rather uneven career at the Bureau and limited linguistic work can be attributed to Brinton's critique, as I've already mentioned, as well as the lack of a college education, indigenous heritage, and maybe procrastination coupled with excessive attention to detail. Clearly, his contribution deserves appreciation for the theoretical insights that he offered early in his career, followed by extensive documentation. Thank you.
Okay, now I would like to invite you to a short trip through the curriculum of one of the most inspiring figures in Polish and the history of Polish anthropology, namely Bronisław Piłsudski. So, Bronisław Piłsudski. Bronisław was brother of the famous Marshal of Poland, Józef, but he's still less known and discussed than his brother. However, he was a figure who combined acts of brave independence with his scholarly life. And his life, research, and legacy can serve as an example that even in the most unfavorable environments, it is possible to find passion and meaning of life. His anthropological research, including language documentation, ethnography, and linguistics, has been recognized and valued worldwide even today for his work on the indigenous peoples of Northeast Asia. At the age of 21, Bronisław arrived on the Russian island of Sakhalin with a sentence of 15 years imprisonment for his participation in preparing an assassination attempt on Tsar Alexander III. Bronisław was forced to work in Sakhalin as a carpenter, but because of his knowledge and abilities, the prison management assigned him to administer the police department and conduct meteorological research. He also educated the local children of the Ainu, of the Nivhu, of the Oroks, and taught them reading, Russian language, mathematics. This also allowed him to acquire knowledge on those unresearched local languages. It was there that he met and befriended with Nivs, Ainu, Oroks, inhabitant of that quite harsh region. He studied and documented their lives, customs, surroundings, and culture. Thanks to his position, Piłsudski enjoyed slightly more freedom than the other exiles. He lived in a cottage and conducted botanical research. And after 2 years on the island, he met Lev Sternberg, also an exile and anthropologist, who encouraged him to start writing a Sakhalin journal. From that moment, Bronisław documented fables, legends, and rituals of the Nivh, Ainu, and Orok peoples. In 1896, due to an amnesty, he was granted settler's right and continued to work as a teacher. After his sentence was reduced, he left Sakhalin. However, a condition of his release was a ban on returning to Europe. So in March 1899, at the invitation of the Amur Oblast Region Research Society, which was a branch of the Imperial Russian Geographical Society, he took up the position of museum curator in Vladivostok. Among other achievements, he co-authored an exhibition for the World Exposition in Paris in 1900. 2 years later, as a representative of the Imperial Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg, he returned to Sakhalin to study Ainu culture. At that time, he also married Chuchsamma, the daughter of an Ainu elder. Continuing his research, Piłsudski, sometimes accompanied by another exile, Wacław Sieroszewski, embarked on an expedition to Hokkaido, where the Japanese had already forcibly resettled most of the Ainu. The researchers recorded conversations, rituals, singing, music, and samples of language on hundreds of Edison wax cylinders phonographs. Some of the world's leading museums and archives, including the National Archive of Poland, but also the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., hold collections of photographs and documents by Bronisław Piłsudski. Some of the photographs shown during my presentation are kept in the Smithsonian collection. The outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, however, forced Piłsudski to leave the island to avoid being arrested as a spy. Upon returning, Bronisław planned to illegally leave the Far East with his pregnant wife and their son. However, his wife refused, as for an Ainu woman, leaving her village was tantamount to disgrace. Bronisław never met his daughter, who was born after he departed. In 1905, he returned to Vladivostok and eventually managed to travel to Japan, where he arrived in January 1906. His 7-month stay in Japan was a time of intensive meetings and collaborations with Japanese and Chinese political figures. He also initiated the Japanese-Polish Society in Japan, but also he tried to get in touch with the Ainu living in Hokkaido. He also completed some of his research and recordings on the wax cylinders. In August 1906, he returned to Europe via America. After a short stay in London and Paris, he settled first in Krakow and later in Zakopane. While in the United States, he had been in regular contact with Franz Boas, the founder of the American School of Cultural Anthropology and an important figure in the already mentioned Bureau of American Ethnology. He focused on studying indigenous peoples in the northern regions. Both brought together experts from around the world to study specific Arctic populations. He even offered a scientific position to Bronisław Piłsudski, who, however, chose to return to Poland instead of pursuing an academic career in the US. In Poland, his achievements and research interests went largely unrecognized. Despite the difficulties, Piłsudski continued his scientific work, focusing not only on the peoples of the Far East, but also on the Podhale region. During the First World War, he became involved in the independence movement, traveled across Europe, and led the Polish-Lithuanian Committee for Aid to War Victims in Lithuania. He maintained contacts with such figures as Ignacy Jan Paderewski and Roman Dmowski. At the end of the war, he moved to Paris, where he worked with the Polish National Committee. Unfortunately, on the 17th day of May 1918, in Paris, a couple of months before Poland regained independence under the leadership of his brother, he tragically died in the waters of the Seine River. This is his gravestone in Paris suburban cemetery at Montmorency. Talking about his legacy, we have to mention monuments erected to the memory and legacy of Bronisław Piłsudski. The first monument was revealed in front of the Regional Museum in Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, the Russian capital of the district of Sakhalin, followed by a monument opened in the Ainu Museum of Shiraoi in Hokkaido, where you can see 4 plaques in 4 languages dedicated to the Polish researcher. Quite interesting is the fact that in the 80s, the story of Piłsudski was quite popular among the Japanese, within the Japanese society. For example, a famous composer, Mariko Hosokawa, prepared a musical for children about Piłsudski Oji-san no Roukan Kara Deta Ohanashi, stories that came out from Uncle Piłsudski's wax cylinders. The musical was performed several times across Japan. We have to remember the scholarly legacy of Piłsudski. Among them, our university, which can be proud with the scholarly monographs of Piłsudski articles and works devoted to the Ainu, Nifu, Orok, Nanai, and other languages and cultures of the Russian Far East. The collected works of Bronisław Piłsudski are still being prepared for publishing by the retired professor of our university, Alfred Majewicz. The 21st century marked a visible change in the attitude to the legacy and memory of Bronisław Piłsudski. At the occasion of 100th anniversary of Poland's independence, also several publications have been prepared, including a popular comics or special coins or post stamps dedicated to Bronisław Piłsudski were issued. At the end of my presentation, I would like to invite you to Żory in Silesia, where in front of the Municipal Museum, you can find probably the only or one of the very few monuments devoted to language documentation. You can see a sitting Bronisław Piłsudski accompanied by an Ainu lady and Edison's phonograph. This monument was revealed also a couple of years ago, but the design was prepared by an Ainu artist from the local Ainu museum in Biratori, Hokkaido, Japan. Well, I had a very great opportunity to meet the grandchildren of Bronisław Piłsudski here at the beginning of the 90s in Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk on the island of Sakhalin. I had an opportunity to meet and talk to Kazuyasu Kimura, Bronisław's grandson, who unfortunately passed away 2 years ago. So I'm saying you thank you in Ainu, in Nifu, in Orok, and first of all, in English and Polish. Thank you very much.
Here again, I'm Igor Krupnik, and I'll be giving the final third presentation of today. It is dedicated to a person who has very much a lot of similarities with Bronisław Piłsudski. He was similarly well known in his time, and then mostly forgotten, and then rediscovered recently, and becoming very, very popular in anthropology and in the Siberian studies. Stanisław Poniatowski was born in 1884 in Poland and studied mechanics at the Warsaw Polytechnic in 1902-1905. He was active in student movement and had to emigrate to Switzerland and continued his education at the University of Zurich, defended his PhD thesis, and then returned back to Warsaw, which was then under the Russian rule, a part of the Russian Empire. He was already known among his colleagues in anthropology, and in 1912, he was commissioned by the Smithsonian US National Museum to travel to the Amur River in Siberia to study local indigenous people. He went to Siberia in 1914, and as I will tell later, engaged in this study that was interrupted by the beginning of World War I. Poniatowski had to stop his field work, returned to Warsaw, left his collections behind, and then when Poland declared its independence, he was a soldier in the new Polish army. He fought in the Russian-Polish War. And after the war, he became one of the leading Polish ethnologists, working primarily in Warsaw. Then his life was affected by yet another war in 1939, when his son was killed fighting the Germans in the Polish army. His wife died. Poniatowski himself was arrested in 1942 in Warsaw for teaching anthropology to his Polish students. He was taken by the Germans to several concentration camps, and he finally died in January 1945, just a few months before the liberation. So the life story of this man included at least 3 wars that affected his life and affected his research career. Poniatowski's trip to the Amur River area in 1914 was done on behalf of the US National Museum and was initiated by the Smithsonian curator Aleš Hrdlička, a Czech-American scientist who was at that time researching the early peopling of the Americas by early Asian populations. Hrdlička arranged for Poniatowski to go to Siberia primarily to do physical measurements of local indigenous people, taking photographs of them as shown here, and also collecting skeletal remains that Poniatowski did not for various reasons, but that was his assignment on the trip. But very early, Poniatowski started to look for something very different. He became interested in indigenous cultures, in material life, in language, and he assembled a substantial collection of ethnographic objects and other specimens that is now being held in 2 different places. One of these places is my home museum, the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. And I personally, as a curator for Arctic ethnological collections, I am in charge of this collection left by or assembled by Stanisław Poniatowski in 1914. The collection itself arrived to the Smithsonian in 1918, 4 years later. It was shipped by the then director of the Khabarovsk Museum, Vladimir Arseniev, himself a very well-known researcher, ethnographer, and explorer of the Russian Far East. So a portion of the collection is actually recorded under Arseniev's name. And you can see on the slide the objects collected by Poniatowski and listed by Poniatowski's and Arseniev's names in the drawers in the collection storage space at the Natural History Museum. Yet, a substantial portion of the collections assembled by Poniatowski on the Amur River is actually being held now at the Polish Ethnological Society in Wrocław. Poniatowski brought certain objects with him from the trip, but also received several shipments of his objects that he left behind in Khabarovsk, organized by Arseniev on his behalf. So the Polish Ethnological Society in Wrocław has over 130 photographs by Poniatowski, anthropometric measurement sheets, like the one I showed before, ornamentations and stencils and paper cuts done by the local Nanai and Udihe people, the drawings also done by local people, and a very interesting collection of pencil drawings of ethnographic objects that reportedly were all destroyed in 1939 during the German siege of Warsaw, when the museum where the objects were held was burned down with this entire collections. So to the right, you can see a very intriguing object like a three-piece arm on a drawing. And at the bottom, there is a very similar piece that is being held in our collection in Washington, D.C. On top, the collection in Wrocław also includes Poniatowski's letters, his diary, maps, and other documents from the 1914. About a decade ago, Polish Ethnological Society, in collaboration with the University of Wrocław Library, organized a major digitization project for the collection by Poniatowski. They created a website, a portal, where most of the collections are currently stored, at least their electronic files. They published two slim volumes describing Poniatowski's photography, edited by Marta Nowakowska, and Poniatowski's ethnographic collections, edited by Stefania Skowan-Markowska, so that today collections are available online in Poland, or actually universally if you, or when you go to the University of Wrocław Library portal, but also at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. on the electronic collection database of the Museum of Natural History. The funny moment to this is that these two website projects developed and were completed without actually knowing of each other. Until very recently, we at the Smithsonian had very little, if any, knowledge about Poniatowski collections in Poland, and our Polish colleagues knew about some of the collections in Washington, D.C., but never had access to the objects or to the electronic files. Among troves of records in Wrocław is the original diary by Stanisław Poniatowski from his 1914 expedition, Dziennik, which was published in 1966 in Polish by the journal Lud. And 40 years later, it was also published in a Russian translation in Khabarovsk, but it's not available in English. So we at the Smithsonian have to rely on either Polish or Russian translation of the original documentation. Poniatowski also collected some linguistic materials, and the only publication from his 1914 trip, which is called Materials to the Vocabulary of the Amur Goldie was the old name of the people who are currently being called Nanai, was in 1923 in English, where Poniatowski presented the list of words, a small vocabulary that he collected, about 400 words, that he recorded primarily from his local partner named Simeon Aktanka, or Genzu, a resident of the community of Sykachi-Alan, who traveled with Poniatowski along the Amur River, in the meantime telling him stories about the Nanai folklore, material culture, rituals, and also the Nanai language. So the story is important today because we are dealing with the collection or collections in plural that are being dispersed among at least two countries, Poland and the United States, perhaps also Russia, because some of the materials related to Poniatowski's trip to Amur River, to the Amur River area, are certainly stored in Khabarovsk. The legacy is published or presented or preserved in at least three languages, Polish, English, and Russian. It is dispersed electronically because it's sitting on two non-communicating websites or web portals. And a lot of this information is actually nicely matching each other and could be much better known and studied and disseminated if brought together under one common cover. So when we recognized this very special legacy of Stanisław Poniatowski dispersed collections, we decided to bring together the records and the databases of the two major institutions, the Smithsonian and the University of Wrocław or Polish Ethnological Society, to produce a combined online database for Poniatowski diverse collections. I'm currently working together with my Polish colleagues, Dr. Joanna Dolinska from the University of Warsaw, Stefania Skowron-Markowska, University of Wrocław, and Marta Nowakowska from the Wrocław University of Science and Technology to produce a combined inventory and hopefully an electronic portal of various collections that were assembled by Stanisław Poniatowski. And to the right, you can see an image of a wooden sculpture that we keep at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. It was acquired by Poniatowski on the Amur River. The paper drawing to the right is the only tag or record or explanation with indigenous names of what is the object and what its meaning, also in our collection. But linguistic materials describing these objects have been published in 1923 in Poland. The diary in which this object is described and its acquisition is actually mentioned was also published in Polish in 1966, and the original is being kept in Wrocław. So this is like a huge puzzle which pieces thrown all over the world that requires very careful and patient matching that hopefully we will be able to produce. And this is, to me, very much akin to the project that was done by my colleagues, our colleagues at the Adam Mickiewicz University related to the Bronisław Piłsudski's legacy. That was similarly kind of spread around in different languages, in different countries, including a portion at the Smithsonian Institution, and was then finally brought together by the dedicated effort that we hopefully may emulate later with the story of another Polish anthropologist. Thank you.
So we have presented to you three profiles of scholars with a global impact. What connected them was undoubtedly their focus on studying languages and cultures that are dominated or were peripheral from a Eurocentric perspective, indigenous, minority, and as time has shown, endangered by reduction, assimilation, and disappearance. Another shared trait was their connection to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. at certain stages of their lives. We hope that we have sparked your interest, or perhaps even inspired you to both delve into these vibrant research careers and the extraordinary museum research complex that the Smithsonian Institution continues to be today.
And we hope that maybe you'll get to read their works about the languages and cultures that they described, and also visit the Smithsonian in DC to see the exhibits and also meet the people who work there. Thank you.
Thank you.